welcome to another episode in my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers, which is my adventures and research into my hobby of living history. My name is Caitlin and I'll be your hostess. I have 20 plus years experience in sewing and 12 plus years experience in living history, and this podcast explores historic clothing, wardrobes, myth debunking, stories and experience from living historians, and also some of how I've incorporated what I've learned from the 19th century into my everyday 21st century life. Last time we dressed an 1860s baby from the skin out and dived into all the layers that an 1860s baby in. And today we're going to take an in-depth look into homespun fabrics in the mid-19th century, specifically how I am working on reproducing a length of homespun goods on my own loom. So without further ado, let's get started. So let's begin this talk with an introduction into my journey into living history, because after 5 episodes, y'all are probably wondering how I got into this, and quite frankly, how I got to the point of looking into homespun fabrics is a long story, so I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about it. So to be quite frank, before 2 or 3 years ago, I did almost exclusively very wealthy class impressions for living history. Specifically, I portrayed a member of the Gross family in Hempstead, Texas, who were the wealthiest people here in Texas for a while. And more specifically, I portrayed the eldest surviving daughter, Mary Henrietta, who grew up at Bernardo and then lived at Leando until she was married at the age of 17. And her father built her and her husband William a very beautiful house that was described as the prettiest house in the county. At least it was until a hurricane blew it over about 100 years ago. While we know very little about Henrietta or Nettie's life, we do know that her Aunt Sarah would frequently go to New Orleans to be fitted for clothing, and then her patterns that were taken off her were sent directly to Paris to be made into the latest style and sent back. The only photograph we have of Nettie shows her very plainly dressed in the mid-1860s, and the 2 paintings we have of her mother show her, to our eyes, dressed very plainly, but she does have a decent amount of lace, which is very expensive. So my goal for much of my living history career was to dress in rich fabrics, but in plainer style, in an attempt to mimic what I knew about Nettie. Homespun is a far cry from what I was researching for the longest time. I knew that homespun was a thing that sometimes people did, but it wasn't on my radar, so to speak, and I had no need to look into it. Growing up, I was in 4-H, and despite most people thinking 4-H is for farmers or for people who have animals, animal husbandry is actually only a small sliver of the things that you can do in 4-H. My main project for my entire 10-year 4-H career was clothing and textiles. So, sewing. And that shouldn't surprise anyone who knows me. It's how I gained a lot of the skills I have today, and when coupled with my forever love of history, both the sewing and the history meshed together into my all-consuming hobby of living history. And that is where the love of old clothes got a hold of me and has never let go. I was never really interested in fiber arts. I had no desire to spin or grow my own fibers, but I did have a slight interest in weaving, and I had a loom for a while. I had a friend in 4-H who was more interested in the fiber arts portion of things and grew her own flax, spun it, and made a suit from the linen. And I remember thinking it was crazy that she went into that much detail, and here I am now. By the end of my 4-H career, towards the end of my high school days, I was making reproduction clothing for my 4-H competitions. I started with a particularly bad polyester gown that I made specifically because instead of prom, a local group of homeschoolers got together and decided that we were going to do a heritage ball, as we termed it, where we learned Victorian ballroom dancing and dressed in hoop skirts. I needed a dress, I knew how to sew, so of course I made it myself. It was my first experience in attempting a period pattern. It was my first true experience fitting a pattern to my body, and I did not do a very good job. I made the usual bad mistakes in that dress. I did not wear any proper undergarments, just a petticoat that likely had an elastic waistband, but I don't quite remember, and a hoop skirt. No chemise, no drawers, no corset, no petticoat over the crinoline. I also made it from the dress itself from a dark blue polyester and trimmed up some really awful modern polyester lace. Fortunately for anyone who is very interested in seeing how badly my living history journey began, my mother was fantastic at documenting all my projects, and there are plenty of photographs of that monstrosity, which apparently impressive enough to not only get first in my local competition, but also at district competition. I went on to state with the dress, but I didn't win state. I remember going to state with that dress, and I got randomly nervous at the interview portion, and I think that's why I didn't do so well at state. Anyway, while researching for that awful blue dress, I learned that there were people who make historic clothing and dressed up for fun. And like other people who were into this, that just shocked me. I learned that there was a group of people who do an event every year just like an hour south of me in Austin. And for the next year and a half, after I made that blue dress, I just began researching. I didn't even attend an event for almost 2 years after finding out that living history existed. What I did instead was make clothes because I wanted to do it right this time. So the next time I wore that blue dress, I had a corset on underneath. It was a particularly bad one. It was made out of hoop boning, but I did have a corset on. It was a learning process. The next dress I made for the next year's 4-H fashion show was real silk that I bought at fabric.com for $5 a yard. And I'm still kicking myself because I sold that dress and no, it was not sewn correctly. I know I would not fit into it anymore, but I love that fabric. It was a gorgeous crimson red silk plaid, and I regret selling that so much. The color looks amazing on me, and if I find it again ever, I'm buying it back because I'll refit it. I'll do whatever I need to. I really love that dress. And now I know so much about remaking clothing and piecing that I could remake that dress to fit me. Even though I had a 24-inch waist, and I no longer have a 24-inch waist. So if anyone happens to have a red silk plaid dress they bought off eBay that's bag lined with like bright red cotton on the inside, and there's an evening bodice and a day bodice, I'd like to buy that dress back from you, please. Because of all the dresses I have made and sold over the years, that is the one I regret selling. Right after that, I made myself some really good underwear, including drawers, a real corset, chemise, correct petticoats, and the dress from the Blue Simplicity pattern from an orange cotton bed sheet, which the fabric was actually not so bad from a period standpoint. It was just more of a children's pattern than an adult pattern. And that Simplicity pattern should never be made from a cotton. It is a wool or a silk style gown. I also made an asymmetrical top wool dress from a wrongly heathered fabric. And that's the point where I started going to events. So my very first event was, I think in 2012 or 2013, I don't remember which. It was in Austin, Texas at Pioneer Farms. It was put on by my friend Annette Jordanson. It was an immersion weekend, so mostly in character, and we were living as though it was 1862. And so many people I met at that event are now lifelong friends, and I still know them. I don't remember much about the event other than having a lot of fun, being very nervous because I didn't know anyone. And I received a letter that I think I might still have somewhere, but it was someone proposing marriage and asking me to move out to California. So that was fun. From that event, it was just a whirlwind, and I learned so much through my own research, but also a lot of what other people have taught me or helped me to look into. I worked at a local museum in college, which had an 1850s cabin on display, and my first venture into lower class clothing was making a dress to wear into that 1850s cabin for school tour groups that came through the museum. I found a blue plaid duvet color at Goodwill for $5 and fashioned myself a dress that was technically my very first correctly made mid-19th century living history dress. And that dress carried me through 10 inches growth in my waist, thank you period remaking skills, then piecing that allowed me to continue to wear that same dress, and 10 years of living history on and off until it was finally retired 2 years ago for good. It is currently on display at the Pierce Museum in Corsicana, Texas, if you happen to be in the area and would like to see it. I have met so many wonderful people in this hobby, including my now husband Rhett, through living history, and a vast quantity of close friends. The people I converse with on a daily basis are mostly living historians within a group chat, and then the girls only spin off group chat as well. And they're some of my favorite people, and those ladies are awesome. Somewhere in the last 12 years or so, I branched out from doing 1860s to 1850s, and then 1830s, and 1820s, and 1870s, and 1880s, and now I'm even doing some 20th century events. But my primary focus has always been the 1850s and 1860s, with a particular interest in and focus on wealthier people. Then after COVID and Leando stopped doing tours, I found that the vast majority of events that were available to me were lower class. So I dived right in and started making lower class dresses, mostly 1830s and 1870s, as I began volunteering at Pioneer Farms in Austin, where I now teach classes once a month. And about 2 years ago, I was asked by a recently made friend from the 1830s who lived in Kansas to attend a Fort McCavitt event that April. I had something else planned. I declined, but when my plans fell through, I randomly messaged the curator of the fort to ask if I would come. Knowing me to only do wealthier impressions, the curator gently told me this was going to be a very working class event, so I sent him a picture of my blue museum dress and that I had not worn since college. 6 or 7 years before, he approved, and I went to imprisoned where I slept under the stars and got locked in a schoolhouse with a recently made friend where we were surrounded by Comanches trying to kidnap us. It was fun, and now we're both married. To different people, of course. So my friend Michaela, to one of the Comanches that was trying to kidnap us, and me to the curator of that museum, Fort McCavitt, my husband Rhett, who was one of the 2 men at the whole fort who decided to come rescue the 2 women in the schoolhouse from the Comanches. And from that point on, I started doing a lot more working class events. 2 weeks after imprisoned, I was asked to go back to Fort McKavett for a school day, and I made myself a cotton wool blend plaid dress that was meant to replace the blue plaid dress that I've remade so many times. That had been through like 3 or 4 remakes, and it's still not replaced. I mean, I love that blue plaid so much. It's my favorite dress, and I can never replace it, and I'm so sad that it has to be retired, but it is on its last leg. It needs to be retired. And that's why it's on display. But through making and remaking that one blue plaid dress over and over again, I learned so much about remaking gowns, piecing, mending, turning dresses. It actually started out very late 1840s in style, and over the last 10 years I have had it. It has slowly and unintentionally morphed into a late 50s and an early 1860s style, completely by accident, and has somehow become an excellent example of how a single dress can change with the fashions and still be the same dress. This dress is the dress that got me interested in piecing and remaking gowns, and I found through working on that dress that I love the puzzle of it. When you don't have enough fabric to cut all the bodice pieces, but you still manage to get it through with a little bit of careful math and piecing, I enjoy that puzzle and that challenge of it all, and that's one of the reasons why I started looking into working class women's wardrobe and poor people's clothing today. The summer after imprisoned, Annette invited me and my friend Paula to Gettysburg for a week in July. Annette graciously hosted us and took us to museums and historic sites, and lo and behold, she had a set of 2 original dresses at her house, alone to her from another friend. So one night we got them out and examined them. Both dresses are homespun, and Annette's friend had lent them to Annette, as Annette has been researching homespun dresses for quite a while. These 2 dresses were completely fascinating to me. Both were striped, although one was definitely more 1850s and better made than the 1860s homespun dress. The 1850s one looked like a regular dress. It had piping at the armscye, a bound neckline, waistline, a pocket. It was lined throughout with linen, and even the linen was pieced. It had bishop sleeves, a hook and eye closures, and it looked well put together. Then there was that cotton 1860s one. That dress still cracks me up because it's a prime example about how not all women were good seamstresses back then. Some of them had barely a faint clue about how to put fabric together, and whoever sewed that dress really had no idea what she was doing. The weaving was bad, the cutting was bad, the sewing was bad. It was just a hot mess. But she got a dress out of it, so that's all that really matters. And when I say the weaving was bad, I mean it was so uneven. It was a blue and white with orange horizontal stripe, and on most of the bodice and skirt panels, it was woven with 2 white threads, 4 orange, 2 white, 6 blue, and then the pattern repeated. On random skirt panels, there was blue in between the white and orange stripes, and when you look at the skirt from high up, you can see where some stripes are much thicker than other stripes. When the thread count between the colors was the same. So whoever wove that fabric was not very skilled in getting her work even. And about 3 orange stripes up from the bottom edge of the back bodice, she did 2 orange instead of 4 orange for that stripe, and then went back to 4. It's the only stripe in the whole dress with 2 oranges. And then on the left sleeve towards the cuff, and it's a coat sleeve, on the outside of the sleeve even, the weaver ran out of orange thread completely. And so what does she do? Well, she just continues the pattern, but without the orange. Just blue and white. And that's kind of why I say she's not perhaps the most talented dressmaker either, or perhaps she just simply didn't care. I don't know which one it is, but now had I been working on weaving myself a dress, and I ran out of a color, I would have likely just dyed more orange thread. But if that wasn't an option, I would do what she did and do the blue and the white. But then I would have strategically hidden that part, like underneath something, like maybe in a dress skirt where it was all pleated up and you couldn't really tell, or even underneath the arm to where you couldn't see, or even on the bottom side of the sleeve instead of the top side, like I would have tried to hide it a little bit more. But no, she just put it on the outside of that sleeve and I guess just wore it proudly. As far as her dressmaking skills, they do leave a lot to be desired. They don't seem to be especially out of the ordinary when speaking about crudely made homespun dresses of the mid 1860s. Some of the others I have seen feature a lot of the unusual for the average dress techniques, such as no piping, no turning under at the skirt waist, self-fabric hem, or no facing or hem tape, turn under bodice edge, etc. The dress was also entirely unlined, which I have seen on other crudely made homespun gowns. So my description of the dresses didn't tell you, this dress has somehow weaseled its way into my mind and just lives there now. And although I've always somewhat been fascinated with the imperfection of historical original dresses, This crazy, haphazardly put together dress has somehow become one of my favorites, and one day I want to recreate it as closely as possible because I just want to. I have been known to tell my friends who ask questions when they make the reproduction clothing that there is period perfection within the imperfection, meaning that everyday period garments are not put together in what we would call a perfectly tailored way, and the little things like raw or hand overcast seams, wonky stitching, etc. is what makes a garment closer to the original piece it's trying to replicate. But this dress goes beyond imperfect. Sometimes I wonder if your average monkey could have woven and sewn that dress with the same level of skill. I just love it. So I didn't do much within my homespun journey for another year, except for I'd somehow started collecting spinning wheels and ended up with 3 of those and a whole lot of wool roving to spin. Then a year later, in July of 2023, Rhett and I went to the Texas Civil War Museum, where we found 3 pieces of homespun specifically to 1860s Texas. One was a little boy's trouser and shirt set that was undyed. Another was a scrap of brown cotton from Smith County. And then there was another gorgeous dress, this time a plaid, and the donor was from my home county of Bell, which is also where I used to work in the museum. I fell in love with this dress too. Beautiful colors, very typical mid-19th century design, mismatched buttons, unpiped arm size. But it was piped on the waistband at the top and bottom. It's just another dress that makes me happy. And it also makes me happy because out of the 2 pre-1865 Bell County dresses I have seen, both of them had unpiped arm size but piping at the waistband. And it's interesting to me because now I'm wondering, is that a coincidence or is it a local fad? I need to find more dresses from my county to be able to tell. There is a bit more skill in putting this dress together, but it's still a regular, very basic dress. And maybe the blue plaid reminded me a little bit of my original reproduction dress that I made so long ago, and that the dress that I'm strangely overly attached to, and maybe that's why I liked this one so much. I took a lot of pictures through the plexiglass with a plan to reproduce the fabric sometime. And throughout that next year, I moved 3 times, got my favorite 1850s spinnet wheel, Bridget, fixed, and bought a giant loom that is taller than me. And a couple weeks ago, I was able to finally put that loom together, so I've been looking forward to what I want to be my first loom project. I thought that I might make another corded petticoat correctly this time, but I decided I wanted to try something a little different first. I had a ton of 16-2 spun cotton that I needed to use, so I decided, you know what, we're going to make a length of homespun fabric. It's been on my list of things to do. I had no idea what I'm going to do with it, but I'm going to make it. One day I want to go from shearing the sheep and gathering the cotton to cleaning and carding, spinning, dyeing, and weaving out a whole project. But for this first project, I wanted to move a little bit slower. I've already done a weaving project, so this time I wanted to add the dyeing step. So I guess next time I'll spin, dye, and weave something. We'll just add one more step each time until I get to the very beginning. I wanted to do a plaid, so I opted to copy the pattern of the dress in the Texas Civil War Museum. It features a lot of blue, which I liked because blue is my favorite color, but I did play with the dye colors just a bit. The original was blue accented with yellow, white, and a very dark blue. Both blues are most certainly indigo, and both shades are easy to get with indigo. It's just a matter of how long you let the yarn sit in the indigo vat. I've dyed with indigo before, and I know that part would be easy, but I didn't want to mess with getting 2 different shades. So I decided to do a red instead of the dark blue on the original. The yarn I already had was white, so I didn't need to do anything with that white layer. The spool stayed as is, but for the other colors I had to use a yarn winder to get all the yarn off the spool and onto a hank so that I could then put it into the dye pot so the dye could actually saturate all those layers. It took me 3 days, but I finally got 4 spools of that yarn into 4 hanks. I decided that 2 of the hanks would be dyed indigo for the main body of the fabric, with a hank each of yellow and red. When dyeing, I started with the yellow. I had a bunch of Osage tree bark shavings. Osage is a native Texan tree. It has very orange bark, and when boiled you can get a bright yellow or an orange depending on the fiber and what you use as a mordant. A mordant is what you use to bind the dye to the fibers, otherwise the dyes may not stick. Having a mordant is basically the difference between a dye and a stain. Some mordants can alter the color of the final project as well. I chose to mordant with alum for both the red and the yellow because I had it on hand. So I dunked the hank of white yarn into warm water that had dissolved in the loam, and I let that soak while I got the Osage bark boiling on a pot of water. Now you could and theoretically should strain out the bark before you use the dye, but I didn't feel like doing that step, so I was throwing out that particular Osage afterwards because I already used it 3 times and the color wasn't as saturated as it used to be. So I didn't mind, shaking tree bark out of my dye when I was done. Now, I do teach the natural dyeing classes at Pioneer Farms a few times a year. That's in Austin, Texas. For those of you in the area, I do teach classes in Austin and also near Waco. And I'll put the links to those below in the description if you are interested. And my method of dyeing is basically, let's try it and find out. So I don't measure anything, I just throw things in and see what happens. I've done cotton and alum mordanted Osage before, so I had an idea of how it was going to turn out. And I just boiled it until the hank of yarn was a little bit darker than I wanted it. And because wet yarn does often appear darker than dry yarn. So I got my yellow. While I was boiling the yellow yarn, I soaked the other hank in alum water as well. When I dumped the dye bath of Osage, I added another pot of water madder root powder, which is the only dye that was not native to Texas. I had cochineal bugs that I had bought that would have been native, but I never liked the colors I got on cotton with cochineal. So I prefer to save my cochineal for wool. I get a lot of corals and oranges with the cochineal, depending on the mordants. I have not tried cochineal with iron mordant. I don't know if that would give me more of a pink or a red, but red can be very hard in a plant-based fiber like cotton, so I went with the madder because I knew I can get like a brownish red. Basically, I did the same thing, boiling it until it was just a few shades darker than my preferred color, then took the yarn out and dumped off the dye pot. Then it was onto the indigo. I have dyed with indigo quite a lot, but never from the plant itself. Since moving 3 times, it has not been an option to grow it myself, and it does not grow wild where I currently am at. So I used powdered indigo, and in the vat I threw some other chemicals that I knew would work because I've used it in all my indigo vats with a ratio of 1 part pre-produced indigo to 2 parts iron and 3 parts lime. I actually had a hard time with the indigo this time, which has never happened before. I would not dye, but just the top layer of yarn. So even though it was really loosely tied together, and I'm not entirely sure what was going on with that, ended up taking 3 separate dippings, 2 of those dippings being overnight to get the dye all the way through. It's still a little splotchy and uneven and darker than I would have wanted if I had done it the way I wanted it. Interesting, the indigo vat was the only one I actually measured my ingredients because I am a screw around to find out type of person. And I always do get the results I want, but I don't know why I measured this time and I didn't get the results that I wanted. And that's one of the reasons I usually don't like measuring, is because when I measure with my heart instead of the scale, it seems to work out better. Every time I just haphazardly throw things into a pot, I get great results. When I try to do things the proper way, they don't, and all I've learned here is to not measure and just go with what feels right. And that's what I've learned from all this. While the indigo was soaking, I decided to do some research into Homespun. Annette has excellent articles and presentations on her website, Texas Civil War Civilian, which I will link below, and that was very helpful to me. Especially on her notes of Vicki Betts' fur homespun dress and all the photos and detailed thread counts and construction notes. That was extremely helpful. And with that, I took my photos of the plaid dress at the Texas Civil War Museum, zoomed in, and used a website called Treadle, which is like Ravelry, but for weavers. If you crochet or knit, you probably know of Ravelry, which is a database of free and paid patterns that you can search. Treadle is the weaving version of that. It allowed me to create a project, in this case the 1860 Texas Civil War Museum homespun dress, upload all the pictures that I wanted, write out a detailed description, and also create what is basically a weaving pattern called a draft. Since most homespun, or at least all the ones I have seen, have been plain weave, the mechanics of it were very easy. But I'd never seen or used a weaving draft before, let alone made one, so I just kind of threw myself into the wolves and just learned all about drafts and how to make one. And the next day, while my indigo was drying, I spent the whole day looking for other mid-19th century homespun dresses that I could pattern, and I think between the Texas Civil War ones, the ones at Annette's house, the fur dress, and a few other museums places, I think I'm up to 13 weaving patterns or drafts that I have made for homespun dresses. So I guess my new side research gig is making a database of mid-19th century homespun dress patterns to further document and research homespun within the 19th century. I am not as much interested in the letters and diaries and articles on how and where homespun is being worn. Besides, I think Annette has done a fantastic job of documenting that part of homespun fabrics, and there's really no need for anyone else to go and reinvent the wheel on that, because there's already such a knowledgeable, dedicated, well-researched person on that case. I am more interested in the mechanics of homespun. So the spinning, if that's happening, because homespun fabric doesn't necessarily mean that the spinning was done at home, go figure. Homespun, you would think, but no. the dyeing, the patterns that are used, and the actual weaving process. So I'm more of a what is going into making the fabric rather than documenting the occurrences of homespun in the 19th century, which is where Annette has been focusing her research. Right now, I am not sharing the database with anyone else other than Annette and a few choice other people because I don't have rights to any of those dresses. I'm really just wanting to document the patterns that were being used for garments woven at home. I do plan on working on contacting all the owners of these lovely garments to see if it would be okay if I shared those patterns with others that I've created for free, because I don't believe in making money off of other people's belongings. Even if I was the one who put the work into creating that pattern, I just don't think that's ethical. But unless I have express permission, I am not going to share other people's garments. I do believe in sharing research and making it accessible for as many people as possible, but I'm also very respectful of other people and their belongings and their rules for their own belongings. So at some point I may be able to share all or some of these patterns with the general public if I get the permission. Right now the database is just for my personal edification and research, but I would like to offer those patterns again for free sometimes in the future. I'm considering offering the owners of the gowns, whether it be individuals or institutions, a bit of the fabrics made up, not much, maybe like half a yard to be used for like educational purposes, so like maybe a touch and feel for museum visitors, or something for people to handle so they're not handling the actual original garments. I don't know, it's just something I've thrown around in my head. Back to the project. After all my yarn was dyed, it was time to warp the loom. I was armed with my freshly dyed yarn and a pattern I'd copied from the original, so I was set to go. And again, I went with the original color scheme, except I put in red where the dark blue was originally. I'm warping the loom to give myself 5 yards of fabric. Not quite enough for a dress for me, but enough for a child's garment or a man's shirt. Honestly, I have no idea what I'll be doing with this, but I did want to go through the process and just learn through making this in the process. So project for the homespun fabric to be determined. Had I need of a new sunbonnet or an apron, I could use that, but I don't think I need a single article of clothing for me right now. So ideas of what to do with 5 yards of 30-inch fabrics are welcome. Once the loom was warped, it was time to put the rest of my yarn onto spools and just begin weaving. Being a very simple, plain weave, under, over, it's a very easy pattern, just an incredibly simple thing to do. Very fast to work too. I believe with my corded petticoat, I estimated I could do about half a yard in an hour. Having the floor loom is so much better than having the rigid heddle, and I'm able to do about a yard in an hour, which means it's going to take me a little less than 5 yards to weave this fabric, even though I'm not done yet. So when I go from plant to dress one day, I am going to document how long it takes me to do each step, to get an idea of how long the finished project actually takes, but I think it'll be a lot more of a shorter time than people expect. And when I have my 5 yards, I will take it off the loom and I'll have 5 yards of homespun goods with no idea what to do with it, which is not very historically minded of me. But this time, it's going to be more about the learning process as opposed to the actual finished fabric. All in all, I think it's going to take me about 2 weeks to do, but that's only working like a few hours a day as opposed to like all day long. And there's like a lot of waiting for the dye to be done and things I had to do. You know, I wasn't able to warp the whole thing in one day. It took me a couple weeks actually to warp it because there was just a whole week or two I just didn't work on it. I think right now I'm probably going to stick with like one big fiber project a year to like not overwhelm myself. So it's going to be a really far down the road project of getting it from plant or animal to dress. Right now I think I'm going to do another corded petticoat and see how easy it is to crank it out on a good loom, because I want to see if it's worth offering up lengths of corded fabric for petticoats and bonnets. I don't even know if anyone would want that, but I'm thinking like $150 would cover my time and the materials to weave 4 yards of 33-inch fabric, which would be enough for a petticoat for people of most heights, plus a waistband. I'm thinking it would take about a day's and a half of work, since I'd be buying the yarn and all I'd have to do is warp the loom and weave it, and I could do like 3 or 4 petticoats at once to make, warping the loom does take a lot of time, so that would like take off that time and would drastically cut the time and cost. And if it only took me say like a day to warp it and 2 or 3 days to weave all 4 petticoats, so I'll be seeing if I can get that to work pretty soon. And that'll just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to the story about how I got into living history and how my slow evolving interest into 19th century homespun has been going. I've had a lot of fun researching for this, and I look forward to doing more. In the next episode, we'll be looking into 19th century dressmakers and how they worked, so be on the lookout for that in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me or find me on Instagram or YouTube under Caitlin Kearns. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers, and if you did, please leave me a review on Spotify or on YouTube, and share this episode with your friends. Also, don't hesitate to tell me what topics you would like me to cover in the future. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next episode.